Topic Notes 3.5 Energy Transfers and Ecological Pyramids. This is a picture of a seahorse over at Blue Heron Bridge, and it's kind of clinging to some seagrasses. Now, when we talk about energy transfers, we look at all the different trophic levels, and the seahorse doesn't actually feed directly on the seagrasses, but it likes to eat the little tiny epiphytes, the things that live on the seagrasses that eat algae, and thus the energy is being transferred from the producers, the little algae on the seagrasses, into the little invertebrates that the seahorse is actually eating. So these are the things we're going to look at. What's the energy efficiency of that transfer? Let's get going. Our main idea today: energy transfer from one trophic level to the next is not efficient and can be represented by ecological pyramids. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is energy. Now, in the ACE curriculum, the energy and the laws of thermodynamics isn't specifically covered. However, the results of those laws are covered, including energy efficiency. So I think it's nice to know what's behind what it is that you're learning. And so that's why we're going to go over it. So the first law of thermodynamics states that energy in an isolated system can be transformed but cannot be created or destroyed. Right? You've probably even heard that before. You can't create or destroy energy. You've also probably heard you can't create or destroy matter. Sort of the same thing. So what this really means is that the total energy in any system, including the entire universe, is constant. Only the form of energy changes. So you can change it from chemically stored in molecules to breaking those bonds and releasing that energy into heat. Those types of things. You can change the form of the energy, but you can't destroy it. This first law is often called the principle of the conservation of energy. Now, this is really important because what you do need to be able to explain is that from one trophic level to the next, as energy is transferred, energy is not destroyed. It's going different places, but it's not being destroyed. So that's a clear thing you need to understand. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is probably the most important to understanding how energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. It states that the entropy of an isolated system, not an equilibrium, will tend to increase over time. Now, this might seem like a lot of physics stuff, right? But let's break it down. What is entropy? Entropy is the measure of disorder of a system. It refers to the spreading out or dispersal of energy. Think of it this way. If you have a fire, right? You put wood in the fire and it's being burned. And that energy is concentrated in the wood and it's being released by the fire. And it's now going out as heat because you can stand next to the fire and you can feel the heat coming off of the fire, right? But you can't recapture that heat and put that energy back in the wood. Essentially, what's going on is you are moving towards an organized form of energy, the energy that's trapped in the wood. You're burning it, and that energy is now released into the system, and it's more spread out. It's more dispersed. It's more chaotic, if you will. That's essentially what we're talking about with the second law. In most systems, you go from an orderly, kind of organized method of energy to a much more dispersed, spread out, chaotic system of energy. And that is a progression that occurs within our universe in general. What this essentially means is there's less order as we go on. And what this means for energy transfer within like a food web and a food chain is energy conversions are never 100% efficient because just like that fire, that heat's just radiating out everywhere. You can't get it back. It's not all being used for useful stuff. So when energy is used to do work, some energy is always lost to the environment as waste heat. You know this because if you ever run or be physically active, play sports and stuff, your body has excess heat building up, right? Where does that go? It radiates away from you and it becomes useless energy. So you are essentially dumping waste energy into the environment all the time. You just don't think about it. That's the second law of thermodynamics. All right, so let's look at, okay, so this can be represented graphically in terms of energy equals work plus heat being lost as waste energy, right? So in this graphic, we'll pretend the blue dot, because we are learning marine science, we'll pretend it's a fish, right? Now the fish has an input of energy that might be from food, obviously. It might eat something. And then inside that blue dot, it's got processes that are going to go on, cellular respiration, it's going to convert some to biomass, things like that, that useful energy of work. That's the green arrow going out. But then you have that squiggly red arrow with heat being lost. Now that heat being lost is not going to be available for, let's say, the shark that eats the fish because it's gone. That is entropy. That is the second law of thermodynamics. It's not an efficient transfer. Now we'll look at the source of the energy. And of course, 90% of the time, that is going to be the sun, right? We do have chemosynthesis, but we're going to mostly talk about the sun here. So globally, only a small amount of the radiation coming in from the sun, about 0.06%, is actually fixed by producers. Now, this may be as high as 1% in aquatic ecosystems because they can actually be a little bit more efficient. So that is not a lot of energy. That big old star shining down on us, very little of that energy is actually be converted into something usable by living things. That's a pretty low efficiency, right? So why is that? Well, first of all, some of the radiation never actually reaches the producers. Some radiation is reflected back into space. Some of the radiation is absorbed in the ocean and not available for producers. Some of it is the wrong wavelength for the chlorophyll or pigments to absorb, and some light will miss the chloroplast and not actually be absorbed at all. Some of the energy is lost during and after photosynthesis. You have energy that is lost during chemical processes of photosynthesis. Essentially, it's not completely efficient, and it does lose stuff as heat. Some of the glucose produced is used in respiration, so only the net primary productivity essentially moves on, right? We've learned that already. Also, uneaten food. Let's say some animal or whatever doesn't eat enough of the plant, so it doesn't get completely transferred over to the primary producer level, the second trophic level, and so on and so forth. Now, we've talked a lot about primary productivity, but there is something called secondary production, which is the rate of production of new biomass by consumers using energy gained by producers. Now, this can involve herbivores or carnivores, so we can be dealing with several different trophic levels here. And also just keep in mind, decomposers such as bacteria and fungi break down dead organic matter to obtain nutrients and also release that nutrients into the environment as well. So this is just something to keep in mind, because when we talk about energy transfers and efficiency, it doesn't have to just be between producers and consumers. It can be between consumers as well. Secondary production depends on the biomass available in the producers and the amount of energy lost through respiration by the consumer. Also, the amount of energy lost as waste products like urine, things like that. There's also an equation you can look at that may be helpful in understanding how this works. C represents the energy consumed by the fish, for example. P is the energy left over for the production of new biomass by the animal itself, by the fish. R would be the energy used in respiration that's being taken away through respiration. Then F would be the energy in feces, and U would be the energy in urine. So if you look at it that way, the P, R, F, and U, all of those are essentially utilizing energy that is coming through the process of consuming food, right? And that's where all of the different energy is going in an animal, or the fish, as we see here. Now we can start to put everything together. So the higher the efficiency in transfer from one trophic level to the next, the more trophic levels an ecosystem can actually support. Now, as it turns out, the efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels is about 10%. It can be a little higher, it can be a little lower. It all depends on a lot of different circumstances that we'll get into. But you can kind of see how this is a process of diminishing returns. So if only in this diagram, for example, you only have about 2% of the energy actually being converted from the sun into phytoplankton, you're already starting off low. Then if you have around a 10% efficiency between the phytoplankton to the zooplankton, That means that a lot of that energy is not available for the first trophic level that includes a fish, for example. And then by the time you get to the tuna, it's a lot less energy. Now, that efficiency of transfer depends on a bunch of things. How much food is actually being eaten? How easy is it for the consumer to digest and assimilate the nutrients? For example, a lot of producers can be a little bit more difficult to digest. How much energy is used for movement? How much swimming around are you doing? How much is lost in the waste production through metabolism, for sure, in terms of urine and feces and such? Some organisms may escape predation, which means the energy in their biomass isn't passed on to the next trophic level. It's probably just dealt with through the decomposers, right? We can also look at thermoregulation and energy transfer. Most fish are ectothermic, meaning their body temperature matches the environment, and don't use the energy from food to maintain that temperature, which means more energy is available to predators because it's not being spent in that way. Now, the efficiency of energy transfer to the next level is a bit higher due to this, between 5 and 15%. Now, on the flip side, tuna, for example, are endothermic. They maintain a higher body temperature than the environment, and so they must expend a lot of energy to maintain that body temperature. The more energy used for respiration to maintain body temperature means the efficiency is going to be much lower in terms of transfer to the next trophic level. So that's going to be around 1 to 5% efficiency. Now, that means whatever eats the tuna is going to get less energy. Now, a lot of this comes down to being able to calculate the energy efficiency between trophic levels. So here's how it works. First, you have the energy transferred to the new trophic level on the numerator, and on the denominator, we have the energy in the previous trophic level. You multiply that by 100 and you get your efficiency. So here's an example of a calculation. From the sun, phytoplankton capture 153,000 kilojoules per meter square per year, and 12,856 kilojoules per meter square per year is passed to zooplankton. So now we're going to calculate the efficiency. We put the 12,856 that is essentially in the zooplankton on the numerator. We divide it by the 153,000, which is the previous trophic level in phytoplankton. We divide that, we multiply that number by 100, we get 8.4%. And that is our energy transfer. That's the efficiency of energy transfer from the phytoplankton to the zooplankton. We can now put things together in ecological pyramids. Pyramids are graphical models of the quantitative differences between the amounts of living material, biomass, stored at each trophic level of a food chain in terms of its standing crop. It allows easy examination of the energy transfer and losses, and it provides an overview of the trophic relationships. It also demonstrates that ecosystems are systems that are in balance. Now, there are a few different types of pyramids. We can talk about pyramids of numbers, which is a diagram that shows the number of organisms in each trophic level of a food chain. This literally is counting individual organisms, right? So scale can be a problem. You could have millions of phytoplankton and just a few, 1 or 2 sharks, and that would be problematic. Also, it's impractical to count all the organisms. For example, who's going to count all the phytoplankton, right? It's not really efficient. So you end up getting odd-looking or inverted pyramids. Phytoplankton, for example, can be consumed very quickly after production, so they tend to show a smaller population versus zooplankton, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you think of energy transfers, right? Also, seasonality and fishing pressures can change the amount of organisms that are there. The size of the organism, parasites, for example, are very small. On terrestrial habitats, you may actually have trees that are very large, so you might have fewer of them compared to consumers. So you get that inversion. Remember, this only shows a snapshot in time, and that's really the key thing to think about. Now, a pyramid of biomass is a diagram that shows the biomass present in each trophic level of the food chain. Now, with biomass, this overcomes some of the difficulty with different sized organisms. Biomass can still change, however, making the data inaccurate over time. Phytoplankton also can still be consumed before measurement. So you do have to consider a few things in terms of measuring through biomass. First, you want to make sure you're dealing with measuring it through unit area, so mass per unit area. Organisms vary in the amount of water that they hold, so using dry masses are more accurate. And of course, if you're doing a dry mass, that essentially means you're killing the organism. So that could be relatively impractical because you would have to kill everything in an area to understand the dry mass of it all. So that's not something we could do. So there's also an inability to assess the whole food chain really because it's just, again, impractical. So we tend to rely on estimates that are not always completely accurate, but they can give us a good window into what is going on in the environment. So we still have an issue with inverted pyramids. Now the biomass of phytoplankton at any one time can be relatively small because they're consumed very quickly. But phytoplankton have a high reproductive rate, so they're constantly being replaced, and that provides enough biomass to maintain consumer levels above them. But it doesn't make sense in the graphical representation because you could consider the bottom tier to be much larger because so much energy is lost with each trophic level due to the inefficiency of transfer. And that's why you get that inverted pyramid. Next up, we have the pyramid of energy, which is a diagram that shows the amount of energy in each trophic level of a food chain. Now with pyramids of energy, these show the rate of production of biomass rather than the standing crop. So we don't tend to get the inverted pyramid situation we did before. It does involve finding the energy at each trophic level, which tends to be more complex and time-consuming, of course, being more accurate. It often uses conversion tables, which converts biomass into energy, so that's a thing. The units for energy for pyramids are often in kilojoules per meter square per year. And it is the most accurate and useful system to understand what's happening. It's just, again, like I said, the more difficult one to get data on. Now, the last thing we'll talk about is what happens during an algae bloom. During an algae bloom, the numbers, biomass, and energy of phytoplankton increase. Now, the zooplankton and other consumers increase as a result of this, so it's a bit of a chain reaction, right? As animals start to die, there becomes a prevalent hypoxic condition, low oxygen. The numbers and biomass decrease again. Less energy is passed down the food chain, and then energy in each trophic level decreases. Now, inedible species of cyanobacteria grow the most during a bloom. Now, this means the proportion of edible cells in phytoplankton decreases. Zooplankton don't increase with increased phytoplankton in this scenario, so the bar for phytoplankton would be larger than expected compared to zooplankton in all three pyramids. All right, that is it for today. So remember the main idea. Energy transfer from one trophic level to the next is not efficient and can be represented by ecological pyramids. Until next time, keep learning.